the Muslims to disrespect him. So I am not suggesting in any way that Muslims living as minorities have the right to publicly disrespect, disobey the civil law, not to act as citizens. We must. But we have to use our individual right, our individual resources, our individual vote, our individual support and dignity, and our collective person to say no. We don't support that policy. No. What you're saying is a lie. No. Islam is a system established by Allah, verified by the Quran, manifested by the life of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And Islam is a better way. And Muslims in their lands are sacred, and that their blood is sacred. And the taking of the Muslim blood and the occupying of their lands is a criminal act. We have to say it. Now there is an issue, we say, of terrorism. We don't have to discuss Islam versus terrorism, because Islam supports nothing other than itself. الإسلام استسلام لله بالتوحيد والانقياد له بالطاعة. Al-Islam is nothing other than istislam, submission to Allah and His legislation, according to the rules of monotheism. وَالْإِنْقِيَادُ لَهُ بِطَاعَةِ, and surrendering to His Sharia, to His ahkam, without any reservation. Completely surrendering with obedience. This is Islam. And Islam has its sources, which can never be changed until the day of judgment. And that is the Quran, and that is the Sunnah. So that is one side. Now terrorism is something else. But to treat this issue properly and objectively, we first need to define what is terrorism. No one can make their own definition of terrorism, because the definition doesn't change from day to day and time to time and place to place. An apple is an apple in China, and it does not become an orange in America. And a president of the United States, or a president of Europe state, or president of Australia, or president of any country doesn't change the name of terrorism or the meaning of it because of his idea. It is a definition, and according to the language, it has to remain a definition. So if we go to any English dictionary, take the Funk and Wagner, take Webster's, take the Oxford, the highest classical dictionaries in the world for the English language, and see what is the definition of terrorism. Not a definition that just came 70 years ago. Not the definition which just came 50 years ago or 20 years ago. Not the definition that the Americans give, or that the British give, or the Australians give, or the French give, or the Germans give. Not a special definition. No, let's go back to the definition which the Oxford, the Webster, the Funk and Wagner dictionary has given for the last 200 years. The definition of terrorism. And listen very carefully, because after we get the definition, we're going to speak about some actions which have been done in the last 200 years since this definition has been made, and you will tell me, is this actions of terrorism or is it not? It says, terrorism, the act of protracted or spontaneous inflicting of systematic attacks and assaults and intrusions upon individuals and places within human populations with the purpose of instilling fear and trauma. Let me read it again, so there is no mistake. The act of spontaneous or protracted infliction of systematic attacks and assaults upon individuals and places within human populations with the purpose of instilling fear and trauma. Now let us examine the last 200 years. Before there was this so-called politicization of this terminology, because this terminology by the United Nations and the G8 countries, that is the countries that are the most developed nations in the world, they have politicized this terminology. They have politicized this definition. In the last 30 years, they have made a special definition for this. But let's go back 200 years and let us see. In the last 200 years, and I want you to add up the numbers as we move along, because those numbers at the end will tell you who have been guilty of terrorism in the last 200 years. The numbers I'm going to give you are the numbers of people that have been systematically slaughtered and destabilized, liquefied, or otherwise eliminated. Let's start out with the invasion of South America by the Portuguese and Spanish conquistadors. And in that incursion, which took place in the 18th century, they slaughtered systematically, destabilized, and otherwise eliminated 56 million people in South America in order to take control of that continent, and they are still holding that continent today. 56 million. How did they do it? Through the act of inflicting systematic attacks and assaults with their armies and their weapons upon individuals and places with human populations with the purpose of instilling fear and trauma. What is that definition? Terrorism. Let's talk about Christopher Columbus on behalf of his Spanish king, Ferdinand, and his French prostitute wife, Isabella. Christopher Columbus was given the crown jewels of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. They sold their crown jewels to some Jewish merchants who built the boats that Christopher Columbus took, headed towards what he called India. You know the story. And he was a fool. And those Jewish navigators who were on the boat with him, they knew that he was a fool. And they knew that once they got out on the ocean, they could not drink the ocean water. But he was a fool. He didn't know that you could not drink the salt water. So those Jewish navigators, they took lemons and lime with them, which lemons and lime will deactivate the salt. So they used to drink it and desalinate the water. But they allowed Christopher Columbus and his crew to drink the water, and they caught something called rickets, and most of them died. So those Jewish navigators, they took him where they wanted to take him, which was what we call now the Americas. Because those Jewish navigators, that's where they wanted to go. Because they had the maps from the Muslims. So they knew where to go. Because they had lived with the Muslims in Spain for more than 600 years. And they knew how to sail the ocean. And they arrived at a place called the Americas. But Christopher Columbus, he survived. But the fool that he was, he still called the place India. And so even today, how arrogant they are, they still call the people in my country, the native people of my country, they still call them Indians. And let me tell you, after Christopher Columbus came back and claimed that land for King Ferdinand and Isabella, they sent more ships. And within 150 years, they destabilized, massacred, killed, liquidated, eliminated 89 million native Indians, as they called them, to take control of what they call the New World. So we got 56 and we got 89. You keep adding for me, please. And what did they do? They inflicted systematic attacks and assaults with their weapons and their ships and their boats and their armies upon individuals and places within human populations with the purpose of instilling fear and trauma. And what is that definition? Terrorism. Their definition. It's not Khalid's definition. It's their definition, which is in the Oxford Dictionary, the Webster Dictionary, the Funk and Wagner Dictionary, all established authorities in their language, their definition. And after them came the French. On the other side of what is called the Americas, the French came from the side which is called California. And the French, they came. And along with the Dutch and the French, they added another 28 million to the number that had already been destabilized, liquefied, and otherwise eliminated. We move on to the land called Africa. Those who had occupied the Americas knew that their own people, their own populations could not do the work that was necessary to build up that country. They needed a new workforce. And so, along with the British and the Dutch and the French and the Spanish, the Americans concocted a deal. They said, let us build boats, and let us also make whiskey, and let us also make guns. So with guns and whiskey and boats, we can barter and trade, and we can go to Africa and take those dark-skinned black heathens, put them in boats, bring them to Europe, to America, in what was called the triangle trade. From Africa to the Americas, to Europe, back to Africa, this is a triangle. And